Well, there was a couple celebrating an important wedding anniversary, and it was their 25th. And they were now also celebrating their birthdays. It happened to be on the same day. And so during this celebration and all the excitement, suddenly this fairy popped into the room. And this fairy says to them, because you have been such a loving couple for all these 25 years, that she would grant them each one wish. Now, the wife had always wanted to see the world. She loved to travel, and so she wished for a trip around the world. The fairy waved her hand, and poof, the ticket for her trip around the world was in her hand. Well, next it was the husband's turn. He paused for a moment, thought carefully, and said rather shyly, well, I'd like to have a woman 30 years younger than me. The fairy picked up her wand, and poof, suddenly the man became 90 years of age. Careful what you wish for. Well, I think it's important for us to keep our sense of humor about getting older, and I know many of you are looking at me saying, yeah, sure, easy for you to say. Just you wait. But aging is a reality of life for all of us, of course, no matter what stage we're in. And this week, as I mentioned with the kids, it was a very special week in my family. It was my father's 65th birthday. And we children, myself and my three sisters, we feel it's our duty to help him sort of ease into this ascent into senior citizens country by some good-natured teasing, of course. So, we call him old man and grandpa and things of that nature, and all in good fun, and all out of love, I assure you, and I'm sure he loves these pet names we have for him now. But in recent years, I've noticed as we've sort of teased him, it's also been to sort of lighten our own kind of moods and minds a bit, because especially on his birthday, we reflect on the fact that almost 5 years ago, he was nearly killed in a car crash by a driver who fell asleep at the wheel and hit his car head on. And when someone has such a near-death experience, it not only changes them, but it also changes the people around them. And we've become much more grateful for the time that we have together. We think about those things that truly matter to us. And I think we also think about the legacy that we want to leave behind us. Now, my father has always been very passionate about the gospel and the spiritual life above all else. He pastored when he was younger and works for a missions organization to this day. And still at 65 years of age, his eyes light up when he has an opportunity to share about exciting ministry that he sees happening in our country and around the world. And to all the seniors out there, and to all the spiritual grandmothers and grandfathers, you inspire us, those of us coming up behind you, by the way that you face life's challenges with a strong faith and a graceful spirit. Those who have seen their hearts nurtured by God's Spirit over a lifetime just have this amazing way to express the light of Christ in the simple things, in a smile or a sparkle in the eye, or in the way you are attentive to the work of God all around you. And we learn today in the gospel that the veterans of the faith, the elderly even, have a very special place in God's kingdom and have a key role to play in revealing Christ to others. The story of the presentation of the Lord in the temple is one that I read this week with fresh eyes. I marvel at Simeon and Anna, two veterans of the faith whose open dispositions to God's revelation allowed them the grace of beholding the newborn Messiah. Now, about Simeon, we learn that he was devout, so devout that he could discern God's Spirit speaking to him. And he had the belief that the promise that he would not die until he had seen for himself the Messiah. And we learn also that he longed for what the Scriptures say is the consolation of Israel. He longed for the consolation of Israel. We'll return to that in a second. Now, Simeon is soon joined by Anna, an elderly prophetess of some 84 years of age. And like Simeon, she was probably seen as extremely devout, maybe even a little bit of a religious fanatic. She literally lived in the temple for 60 years, and praying and worshiping all day long and depending on others for nourishment and sustenance. And sometimes those of us who work in the church feel like we live in the church all day long and joke about getting cots and things like that to make it a little easier. But she literally lived in the temple all that time. She was kind of like those sparrows and the swallows that the psalmist describes in our psalm today that found shelter in the temple. Happy to be one of those who lived in the Lord's house, ever offering praise and thanksgiving to Yahweh. And she longed, we find, for the redemption of Jerusalem. There's two phrases, the consolation of Israel and the redemption of Jerusalem. They're packed with meaning, and they express some of the deepest hopes and longings of these two profoundly spiritual people. Within these two phrases lay the hope of an entire people, a nation, that had survived occupation after occupation and calamity after calamity. And this hope in these phrases we can find rooted in the Old Testament scriptures, more specifically in the prophet Isaiah, which is the book most often quoted in the New Testament. In Isaiah chapter 40, we find God consoling or comforting his people. "Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak kindly to Jerusalem and call out to her that her warfare has ended and that her iniquity has been removed." I would ask, how is God going to comfort his people? Well, Isaiah had a very clear picture that he would comfort his people by sending his agent, the Messiah, to be God's peaceful revolutionary, bearing good news of God's transformative presence. And this good news would begin in Jerusalem, but it wouldn't stay there. It would spread throughout all the world. And Isaiah and Isaiah's people longed for this day with great anticipation, when the curse of Eden would be reversed, when the Lord would comfort the brokenhearted and bring healing and restoration to the world. And then Isaiah's writing sort of shifts from consoling language to redemptive language. Those who know what it was like to be captives and slaves in their own land are promised freedom. Isaiah writes, "Shake yourself from the dust, rise up, O captive Jerusalem. Loose yourselves from the chains around your neck, O captive daughter of Zion. For thus says the Lord, you were sold for nothing, and you will be redeemed without money." Now, Isaiah's people had been conquered and thrust into slavery. And in those days, redeeming a slave meant paying a price, a monetary price, to free them. But God's promise is that they will be redeemed without money. That God would personally redeem his people in the sight of all the nations, that all the ends of the earth may see the salvation of our God. Now, people like Anna and Simeon were still longing for this day. They were still waiting for this promise to be fulfilled. That day of salvation. That day when everything would change. The day when God's salvation would be manifest like a shining light, casting out the darkness of grief and despair, rectifying injustices, bringing salvation to all people. And they were able to see in the face of that infant child God's promises being fulfilled. They could see that all those years of hoping and yearning, of fasting and praying, were now finally starting to come to fruition. And it inspired them to praise and worship God in exuberant abandon. "My eyes have seen your salvation," cries Simeon. He's overcome with excitement, with energy, with hope. I've been really moved this week by seasoned worshipers I've come across, like Simeon and Anna, who were moved by the Spirit of God over many years, and who are able to recognize God's Spirit at work in one another and in the world. As I mentioned with the kids, when I was celebrating my father's birthday this week, I had some interesting encounters with some people I hadn't seen in many years. In addition to the fellow I talked about with the kids, was this couple who were in their later years, in their later 70s, and I had hadn't seen them for a long time. I was amazed at how little they changed and how well they were doing. And they hadn't seen me for many years, probably since I entered the ministry even. And so they're asking me about that and how things were going. And I told them about all the wonderful people at St. Matthew's, and also that we were in the midst of exploring some changes and looking to move forward into the future. Now I knew that they were undergoing very significant changes, or had undergone very significant changes in their own church, the church that I'd grown up in. And in a way, it sort of gave them an opportunity or an excuse to sort of let out any sort of frustration or confusion about those changes. Because I knew that some of those changes involved changes to the way that they worshipped and the way that they preferred to do things. We talked about how change is hard for all of us, and how challenging it can be to discern God's leading through times of change. But then they said something that really hit me, and the wife of the couple turned to her husband and said, "But you know, dear, if we weren't open to change, we wouldn't have what we have now." And I was really struck by their attitude. I admit that I don't know that I would have had as good attitude as them. Even though that a lot of their preferences in worship style had fallen out of fashion in their church, they were still able to see that God was doing some good work in their midst and in their church. I believe that they would probably share in my definition of Christian tradition, that it is the Spirit of God working through people over time. And like Anna and Simeon, these veterans of the faith were led by the Spirit to see the signs of hope and new life all around them and within them. As I shared with the kids later that night, we had a little bit of a Blackmore hoedown and a kind of a gospel hour. Seriously, if you're a Gaither fan or any of that kind of music, you would have loved it. And my father is a terrific guitar player and used to lead worship when he pastored. And so they brought out all these old songs, and I have these images sort of imprinted in my heart and mind now, and also on my iPhone, which is handy. And I was just so touched by this one person in particular who I shared about earlier with the children, that despite his failing health, nothing has dampened the Spirit of God within him. And as he sat in his chair and closed his eyes and worshiped the Lord, and he sang those gospel songs of old, you could see within his countenance the light of Christ shining through. He sang those songs of hope, songs of joy in the Lord, songs of praise and thanksgiving, songs of God's salvation and consolation, songs of Simeon and Anna. As we journey through this season of change together, and seasons where we are trying to listen to one another to hear what the Spirit is saying to the church, we hope and trust that God will lead us to seasons of hope and renewal, even if we don't exactly know where we're going to end up. Simeon and Anna, I'm sure, could not have fathomed the journey that this infant child, that the Christ would undertake, that his journey would lead him to the cross before his resurrection. And so we too really don't know exactly where we're going to end up, where this journey will take us. But I believe the important thing is that our eyes be open to leading of God's Spirit, that our eyes be open to see God working in and around and with and through one another. And in the days to come, may we find God satisfying our deepest hopes, our deepest longings, easing our anxieties and our fears, and so that in that day, that we would join with Simeon and Anna and be able to declare our song, "My eyes have seen the salvation of God." Amen.